Right, good morning. I'm here to present on Ibero-Romance complementation, namely on el deísmo, which is a very specific phenomenon. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizers of the University of Graz for inviting me to the inaugural, first ever workshop on sort of expanding Romance linguistics. It was truly an honor for me to be here and to interact with so many distinguished scholars in our field. I'd like to thank the Ronan Institute for the ongoing support of my work, all my friends and colleagues and your fellow Ronan scholars there. In fact, an earlier, so a shorter version of this was presented as a lightning talk to all my fellow Ronan scholars on the 22nd of June earlier last month. Finally, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to all my informants of Spanish from all around the world, from Spain and also from many parts of Latin America. Just say that sin ustedes nada. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to talk about Romance and prepositional infinitives, which are extremely common in Romance languages. The most basic definition is they consist of prepositions. It's of selecting infinitives, and they're very common. Now I'm going to look at a particular type of prepositional infinitive, namely those that function as a direct object of the verb, that those are selected by a lexical verb. The categories of these types of prepositional infinitive are open to different analyses. It's been pointed out in many formal and generative analyses that prepositional infinitive can either be PPs or MPs. So this goes back to Riti's seminal work, where he argues that prepositional infinitival markers are low C elements that he calls fin, but other people have since called M, which we shall look at later. So, for example, in Italian, it's possible to say things like this: affermo di fare questo. The interesting thing here is that di cannot select a noun. So, the equivalent nominal object form of this construction would be lo affermo or affermo questo. We would not use the di here. Similarly, in French, pardon my French, because alas, I don't speak French, but if I just try and do this, Jean le redoute licencié. Similarly, Jean redoute un licenciement. So, we do not use the preposition here. But so, the category of these prepositional infinitives is open to conjecture, because it just seems that these are not genuine prepositional phrases, because they do not consist of a preposition selecting a nominal object. Secondly, prepositional infinitives are very widely selected by reflexive verbs. Reflexive verbs are also very common in Romance languages, because they consist of a clitic pronoun being selected by a verb. And here, let's have a look at Italian. In Italian, it's possible to say things like this: mi vanto di fare questo. Okay, we could also say mi vanto di questo. I boast of this, di questo. Or we could use the prepositional clitic pronoun, the me ne vanto. In French, similarly, again, pardon my French again, but then let's try and do this. So Jean se réjouit de partir. Jean se réjouit de ce voyage. Or Jean s'en réjouit. So similarly, French also permits the use of the prepositional clitic pronoun here, which corresponds to Italian there. So we see the difference between these examples and those on the previous slide, and here the preposition selects a nominal complement, whereas those on the previous slides don't. So the main difference between reflexive verbs and non-reflexive simple verbs is that reflexive verbs always seem to select genuine PPs, where the P selects a noun. Whereas with the non-reflexive verbs, there is a variation here, which we shall see later on. Right. So if we just focus on Ibero-Romance, for example, Spanish, it's been widely noted that Ibero-Romance prepositional infinitives are rarer than those in Italian and French. For example, a very common verb to decide, decidir in Spanish. When we say things like, so for example, this example taken from the Graham compendium by Skutska, and Daniel decidió seguir el viaje. Okay, decidió seguir el viaje. So the equivalent forms in Italian and French would be something like this. So for example, Italian, so decise di studiare il fiume. Decise di. French, déciderai de partir. Yeah. So while Spanish uses the bear infinitive, the equivalent forms in other Romance languages, like Italian and French, you select, the infinitive plus there. Whereas if we try to reflexivize the verbs, for example, decidirse, we get things like this: me decidí a concluir la carrera. Decidirse obligatorily selects this prepositional infinitive. It also marks it out from the simplex non-reflexive form. So this has been widely taken down to valency because reflexive forms, technically speaking, they are saturated. The verb selects a reflexive pronoun, and then the PP seems to function as an adjunct. Simple verbs, they're simple non-reflexive verbs. The verb is technically not saturated, so it can either select an infinitival complement that is there, as we see in Spanish and decidir, or it could be headed by a P, as we see in Italian and French. So it's been widely pointed out, namely by Green and Hernandez in the famous chapters on Spanish complementation, that prepositional infinitive are adjuncts when they're selected by reflexive verbs, whereas when they're selected by non-reflexive verbs, certainly in Spanish, the bare infinitives are much more common. Right, there is a phenomenon that and that's the and that forms the center of my presentation here today, and that's that's widely called el deísmo, namely the use of de plus infinitive in Spanish varieties. Many people have written about this, especially in recent years. For example, Angela and Julio, Camus and Benito and Enrique Paque, etc. They've all looked at the use of de plus infinitive in Spanish. Certainly in Spain, it's been noted in Andalusia and La Mancha, etc. by informants from those areas. They tell me that el deísmo tends to be colloquial, regional, but also rustic. You tend to hear them in the countryside, and they also have a somewhat rough feel to them. So these are things that people would say in very informal and also perhaps in non-urban context. Once you get a more domestic setting, a more formal setting, these tend to be avoided. But, for example, in these areas in Spain, we get examples like this. For example, esperar. It's possible to say that espero de verte pronto. I hope to see you soon. So in standard Spanish, it would be espero verte. So in line with decidir on the previous line. We simply get the de in infinitive. However, in Spanish and dialects, we get espero de verte. This corresponds to Italian, sperare di, or I could have added French as well. In French is j'espère de plus infinitive. Desear. It's possible to say that estoy deseando de llegar a casa. In Spanish, this would simply be estoy deseando llegar a casa. Whereas in other dialects of Romance, for example, Italian, we get forms like desiderare di plus in infinitive, which also corresponds to these dialectal forms. For example, there's also this example permitir, no permito a mis hijos de llegar tarde. But, in standard Spanish, it would seem no permito a mis hijos llegar tarde. In other Romance dialects, for example, Italian and French, we will get the de here plus infinitive. So these examples of deísmo, even though they are attested only in dialects and and also in an informal rustic context, they do find the parallels in other Romance languages. Another property of theirs, and there are examples where they seem to form unbindable pairs with their in infinitive. So, for example, alternations like this, decir, when we use there, it tends to denote an indirect command. So, for example, take example, Andrea me dijo de ir al cine. To mean that Andrea told me to go to the cinema. It's an indirect command. Whereas without de, Andrea me dijo ir al cine, it will be an indirect statement. Andrea told me that he would go to the cinema. Pedir, likewise, me hijo me pidió de ir a jugar. To mean that my son asked me to go and play with him. So the subject of the infinitive would be governed by the object of the main verb me pidió de ir. Whereas if we don't use de, for example, me hijo me pidió ir a jugar, this would mean that my son asked me if he himself, he alone, could go and play. So this alternation between the use of de and the de infinitive seems to be a semantic one. De denotes indirect command, whereas de infinitive denote an indirect statement. Well, I think one thing needs to be said about verbs of command. Verbs of command, as was briefly mentioned on the previous slide, is these are objects controlling verbs, and the subject of the infinitive that widely denoted by this label called pro is controlled by the object, namely the indirect object of the main verb. First, with indirect statements, as we saw on the previous slide, the subject of the infinitive is controlled by the subject of the main verb. So if we schematize this, so the verb selects an indirect object and the infinitival complement. The infinitive consists of a subject plus the verbal part. The subject of the infinitive is controlled, i.e., it's co-referential with the indirect object of the main verb. And here, we get a dialectal a variation between peninsular European Spanish spoken in Spain and certain parts of Latin America, because in Latin America, it's been noted chiefly by Montalbetti in his famous 1999 chapter. I've also since discovered examples of this in Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and Venezuela. There plus infinitive, is only used in the passive. So, for example, are these examples. María fue impedida o María fue permitida, prohibida de hacer algo, de ir al cine, etc. So we get them in the passive, where Maria was prevented, permitted, prohibited, etc. From doing something or to do something. We crucially do not get the there forms in the corresponding active. So, for example, the active form, we simply have the there unmarked infinitive. So, for example, Juan le impidió, permitió, prohibió hacer algo. So in Latin American varieties, we also get sporadic attestations of there plus infinitive. Interestingly, we only get them in the passive, not in the active. All right, so I think let's summarize what we've just seen so far. There was Spanish and dialectal variation in the use of there plus infinitive. All right, so el deísmo, namely the use of there as a marker of infinitive. We have them in non-standard Spanish dialects. But we also get a micro variation between European Spanish and Latin American Spanish in these particular regions. In European Spanish, we tend to get there in the active, whereas in Latin American Spanish, we get there only in the passive. So I think in the former, we can say that there introduces an external argument that's being controlled by the object, as we saw in the alternation between the use of there and there in infinitive with verbs like pedir and decir, etc. Where there introduces an indirect command where pro, the object of the infinitive, is controlled by the object, by the indirect object of the main verb. Whereas, in Latin American Spanish, there seems to be exclusively used in passive construction. So I think it somehow licenses, the passivization of the object of the main verb. We shall, see this in more detail later on. In fact, in European Spanish, the corresponding there forms cannot be passivized. So, for example, and also as we saw on the previous slides, Latin American Spanish cannot be used in the active forms. So, for example, in Spanish, I've tested this, with my informants from those particular regions of Spain, and they tell me that they absolutely do not accept passive forms like fue impedido, fue permitido, fue prohibido, etc. There. Whereas, in Latin American Spanish, I've also tested this with speakers from numerous parts of Latin America, including those, where there infinitive, is used in the passive forms. They emphatically tell me that they would never use there plus infinitive and the active counterparts. They would only use the there in infinitive here. So I think we can probably parameterize el deísmo, is defined as the use of the there plus some infinitive according to regions. In Spain we only have them in the active, whereas in Latin America we only have them in the passive. So that's a pretty neat and a fascinating conclusion for me, which I shall look in more detail as we go on. Okay, I think a few things need to be said about there. As we saw on the first few slides, the use of there plus infinitive are common in other Romance dialects, for example, French, Italian, etc. And the examples of deísmo we saw on the first slide about Spanish deísmo, is that they also correspond with examples in other varieties of Romance. The point is, prepositional infinitive headed by there in denoting either statement or command, are absolutely not rare across Romance languages. So, for example, Italian. There is this very nice examples provided by Scoot, which is ambiguous, as she says, because this construction, it can denote either an indirect command or an indirect statement. So, for example, dini, dinon, and partire, and Giovanni. This can mean either tell me that you yourself aren't leaving, Giovanni, or it could be an indirect command, tell me not to leave. So this is ambiguous between an indirect statement and an indirect command where the infinitive is marked by there, or Italian d. In French, I haven't found an example in modern French where the marks an indirect statement, but there's this example which in verb introduces an indirect command. So m'a dit marcher, je marche. Okay, so he told me to leave, so I leave. Is an indirect command where the infinitive is marked by there. And certainly in the history of Spanish, so for example in medieval Spanish, there are quite a few examples, where there expresses both an indirect statement and an indirect command. So for example, one of the earliest texts in history of Spanish, the Primera Crónica en General, it denegó de enviarles ayuda. So you wouldn't have this in modern Spanish. In modern Spanish, in indirect statements, you would not use there. It's tested in medieval Spanish. Denegó de enviarles ayuda. He denied to send them help. And also, with indirect command in the same text, there are also these and there's also this example. Estos que ellos ordenaban de poner, ordenar de poner. Okay, where there also introduces an indirect command. So the use of there plus in infinitive is absolutely not rare, both in the history and also in the comparative spectrum of Romance. It's such a wide distribution, has led scholars to believe that the genesis of prepositional infinitive to go back to Proto-Romance and also to Latin, that scholars, from as early as Dix in 1876, and also by Beardsley, and more recently by Nigel Vincent, to claim this. And although Latin does not have a prepositional in infinitive, it has been argued that the Latin prepositional gerund gerundive can express the indirect statements and commands, which may anticipate a romance, because it's been argued chiefly by Schulze, the prepositional gerund gerundive. They are the oblique forms of the infinitive, and as such, they are equivalent to the proto-romance and prepositional infinitives. So, for example, in Latin, there are examples like this. So, for example, Augustine, cum debutando praecipere hominem. Praecipere means to preach, to teach, and here the object of a praecipere is headed by de, which denotes theme and content, etc. So when he taught about changing man, I should also note that this is also ambiguous between subject control and object control, because it's not made explicit just who's doing the changing man. So whether it was the preacher, or whether the preacher was teaching others to teach to change man. So this is also ambiguous between your indirect statement and indirect command. And a more straightforward example for from Nepos is this one. So vele secum eo colloqui de atiendo regno. Okay, so he himself wanted to have a chat with him about dividing the kingdom. So de atiendo regno expresses the indirect statement of the main verb colloqui. So from these forms, we can probably derive the proto-romance prepositional infinitives, and these undergo different diachronic trajectories in different Romance languages, as we saw on the previous slide. Okay, we have now identified an empirical phenomenon that we want to look at. You named Spanish, non-standard Spanish, el deísmo, de plus infinitive. The distribution is interesting, because not only are these types of infinitives, non-standard, sporadic, and also used in regional dialects, there's also this somewhat neat dialectal variation between European and Latin American Spanish, which is determined by grammatical voice. We only get the active forms in Spain, only get the passive forms in certain countries of Latin America. We've also established that these probably go back to medieval and also to a proto-Romance Latin. So these seem to be genuine Latin forms that have inherited into Romance. So we are looking at how these infinitives headed by de have been retained and distributed in these different Spanish dialects. A popular and mainstream theory, of course, the theory of phases, introduced by Chomsky at the turn of the millennium, and that's still current. It's still going strong. And according to phases, one big innovation of phases, arguments are now believed to be introduced by certain functional heads. In the case of external argument, i.e. the subject, it's believed that the external argument is introduced by the C head. So the T head inherits the external argument from C. And also this idea of phases, phases determine the mechanism of spell out. We will only spell out one phase at a time. So the whole derivation is divided into different phases, where each phase gets sent to spell out at a time. If we look at the derivation of de plus infinitive again, we would argue that de, being a low C element, but it's still an element in the left periphery of the infinitive. This introduces the external argument into the infinitive, which is a non-finite clause. And here, the subject of the infinitive, i.e. pro, seems to be correlated with the use of there, which is a key assumption that we shall look at later on. Right, certain things need to be said about passivization. Not only in Romance, but more generally, in order to account the voice patterns in Latin American Spanish in comparison to European Spanish. For example, it's a mainstream position that in passivization, the object is moved to the subject position. This is due to the famous generalization proposed by Mabuzio, in that he argues that object case is coexistent with the external argument. So, when a verb loses its external argument, it also loses its ability to assign object case. And so, according to this assumption, namely case a filter, says that all over arguments it must have case. The internal argument, i.e. the object, must move to another a position, another case positions in order to receive case. So this is essentially a case-driven derivation of grammatical voice, where the object moves to the subject when the original external argument is deleted. Certainly, with this type of verb, namely the exceptional case marking, now one knows the ECM verbs. It's been argued that the subject of the embedded infinitive, if it's co-referential with the object of the main verb, as we saw on previous slides, those are the indirect command, where the indirect object of the main verb controls the external argument pro of the infinitive. The subject of the embedded infinitive moves to the main clause, namely to the object position, and there it can further move to the subject position if they are passivized. Now, a recent paper, proposed by, a recent paper written by Michelle Sheehan and Sonia Cyrino in the NELS proceedings, they showed that in Romance, specifically in Brazilian Portuguese, in different verbs selected different types of infinitival complements that show differential patterns of passivization. Only certain verbs allow passivization of these ECM type contexts. So, for example, big example. Os meninos foram feitos, vistos, mandados, deixados sair. Okay. Now, Sheehan and Cyrino, they show, and this has been, supported by all my Brazilian Portuguese informants as well, as in these type of, passivization of ECM verbs, and we can only apply passivization to mandar and deixar. We cannot apply them to fazer or ver. So, the boys were allowed, ordered to leave, but we cannot say the boys were made or seen to leave. Certainly not with the in infinitive, or with the other non-finite verb forms. That may be possible. Okay, so within an ECM context, the formal analysis in accordance with the last Nikonsi, Nunes, Martins, etc., is the subject of the infinitive, which is a co-referential with the indirect object of the main verb, is raised to the object position of the main verb. It's possible with mandar and deixar, but not with fazer or ver. And this argument can be further raised to subject position in passivization. So, for example, os meninos. So the proform of os meninos is base generated as an external argument of the infinitival complement here, sair. It moves to the object position of the main verb. It then moves further to the subject position, and hence be passivized. We then get this type of ECM passive form, os meninos foram, and then mandados or deixados and sair. Yes, so Sheehan and Cyrino, they differentiate these differential patterns of a passivization by arguing that causative verbs like fazer and a perceptive verb like ver, it selects a smaller complement than mandar and deixar. yes, I've simplified their analysis slightly by saying that the former select a VP, whereas the latter select a TP. Formally, if we try to represent this, so on your left hand side, you get the complement of the infinitive of complement being a TP, whereas on the right hand side you get a VP a complement. Point of it is the pro, so the subject of the infinitive, if it's big enough to be a TP, it would be base generator in the spec of T. And from there, it would move to the object position of the main verb. So they call it the spec of V. From there, so this is the ECM derivation where the embedded subject moves to the matrix object, and there it can move further to the matrix subject position. So hence we get the passivization with verbs like mandar and deixar in Portuguese. Whereas with causative verbs and verbs of perception, point of it is the complement is too small. The complement does not have a face head, and hence doesn't have a face edge. For the higher phase, namely the main verb to probe into. But this again goes back to the PIC condition, which says that we can only spell out one phase at a time, and so phase heads cannot probe into a lower phase. This is again proposed by Chomsky at the turn of the millennium, and it seems it's still the common assumption nowadays. And so on the right hand side, if the infinitive complement doesn't project a phase head, the main verb cannot probe into the infinitival complement. Whereas on the left hand side, the fact that the infinitival complement does have a phase edge, namely the spec of T. Spec of T can move further into the main clause and to be pacified, etc. Okay, so here is a nutshell of Sheehan and Cyrino's analysis. If we try to apply this to Spanish, right? So if we have a look at Spanish data again. Okay, so we get micro-parametric variation between European Spanish and Latin American Spanish. So we get active forms and only the active forms in Spanish of Spain, but we only get the passive forms in Latin American Spanish. In the passivization of the ECM verbs, when the embedded subject moves to the matrix object position, and then to be pacified and moves into the matrix subject position. So we get this A chain. And here, following the Sheehan and Cyrino's proposal, only infinitives that are big enough allow this A chain to occur. Because it needs to be big enough for the embedded subject to move into the matrix object in accordance with a PIC. Okay, so here it seems that there projects an escape hatch, the specifier of M, which lies on the edge of the phase. This provides a structural position for the embedded subjects to move into, and hence move into the main clause. And also, this thing with the matrix object is that we have seen that the passivization that we saw with the Latin American ECM verbs is it's the indirect object that undergoes passivization. So similar to English, where there's something a phenomenon called dative shift. It's there needs to be an applicative head. There's an applicative head which remerges the indirect object, and it is this indirect object that gets moved to the spec of T when these indirect objects are pacified. So there seem to be two structural positions here. It can be parameterized, namely, the therefore in the infinitival complement, which projects this escape hatch, the spec of T, and also this apple, this applicative head that projects the spec of applicative containing the indirect object. And so we get this A chain that seems to be work in the passivization of ECM verbs. So if we try to formalize this, all right, so we get this type of structure. We first have the two parameters are these two positions which we saw on the which we explained on the previous slide, and we get the external argument to emerge in this spec of t of the infinitive. There it's merged, and there provides you an escape hatch for the external argument to move into. So it can move into the spec of m, and then so this is the escape hatch, which permits the external argument to move into the main clause. Then you move further into the spec of apple, so namely the indirect object, which has to be remerged in the specifier of the applicative head, similar to English dative shifts. And there it can move further to the passive voice head, and also further to the matrix of subject position. So this is the A chain that seems to underlie passivization of the ECM verbs. Yeah, so here the main difference between Latin American Spanish, where we only get there forms in passive, and Peninsular Spanish, where you only get the there forms in the active. So Peninsular Spanish doesn't seem to project Appleby. And so if you look at the A chain again, while Latin American Spanish has this spec of apple, which completes the chain and permits passivization of the ECM verbs, Peninsular Spanish crucially doesn't project Appleby. So the chain is broken, and we hence cannot pacify ECM verbs in Peninsular Spanish. So we only get active forms versus some passive forms in Peninsular Spanish and Latin American Spanish, respectively. Okay, so if we just summarize and conclude. All right, so we see the dialectal data in deísmo, which is defined as the use of there as an infinitival marker. And here, the main isogloss seems to be drawn between the Peninsular Spanish and Latin American Spanish, so namely, in these regions. In the former, we only get their forms in the active, whereas in the latter, we get their forms in the passive. If we adopt the Chomskyan phase model that's been recently embellished and developed by Michelle Sheehan and Sonia Cyrino, etc., this A chain is only possible depending on two specific structural positions, namely the infinitival marker there, which can provide an escape hatch, namely the spec M, and also there needs to be an applicative projection in the main clause for the indirect object to be passivized. So this A chain seems to be the formal correlates of the passivization of ECM verbs in Spanish. And while Peninsular Spanish doesn't seem to project the Appleby, which hence breaks the chain, Latin American Spanish does, and this completes the chain, and we hence get the air forms in the passive. So this seems to be the micro parametric variation that we can posit for the dialectal data in Spanish. So that's it for today. Thank you all very much, and please get in touch.